Hi dear students, welcome back to the third session of Rise of Nationalism in Europe, class 10th history lesson. In our last class, we discussed how the nationalists of the France created the spirit of nationalism in in France, and what was Napoleonic Code or what were the reforms introduced by Napoleon that ultimately helped France and Europe to unite themselves. Today we are going to understand three important topics of the second chapter, that is, what was the picture of Europe in 1750, or how scattered the European map of mid 18th century. Later we will understand the aristocracy and the new middle class. And thirdly, we will also understand what is meant by liberal nationalism. So these three topics today we are going to discuss. Dear students, at first let's understand the map of mid 18th century, that is around 1750s. Actually, there was no any nation states in Europe in mid 19th century. Let us see how many countries, how many local kingdoms culminated in the European map of 18th century, mid 18th century. So today's Germany, Italy and Switzerland were divided into many kingdoms, and Holland and subdivisions included many autonomous territories. Eastern and Central Europe were under autocratic monarchies, and they had very different groups of people. So just understand that Germany, Italy and Switzerland, three important today's major countries of Europe, were divided into many small kingdoms. Holland and other subdivisions were ruled by many autonomous means self-ruled, autonomous territories. Eastern and Central Europe were under the autocratic monarchies. That means eastern part of Europe, central part of Europe. These regions were under many kings, and their territories included diverse people, the people who speak different language and the people who belong to different culture. And these people or these kingdoms did not see themselves as a sharing collective identity or a common culture. Understand that we are trying to understand how did nationalism emerge in Europe. So before going to understand that, we are analyzing what was the real picture of Europe in 1750s. So the people of Europe had no any collective identity due to the diverse physical culture. See, often these people spoke different languages and they even belonged to different ethnic groups. The Habsburg Empire. Let's take the example of Habsburg Empire. Actually, this Habsburg Empire, which was ruled over Austria-Hungary, was a patchwork of many different regions and peoples. So we are understanding how complicated the 1750s map of Europe. The Habsburg Empire that ruled over Austria-Hungary is an example to show that it included many different regions and different kind of peoples. It included the Alpine regions, the Tyrol, Austria and the Sudetenland, as well as Bohemia, were included many German speaking people. This Habsburg Empire also included the Italian speaking provinces of Lombardy and Venetia. So it shows that many different group of people who spoke different languages included in Habsburg Empire. If you consider Hungary, in Hungary, half of the population spoke Magyar, while the other half spoke a variety of languages, dialects, local languages. In Hungary, the people spoke mainly Magyar language, while the other half spoken variety of other languages. In Galicia, if you consider, the aristocracy spoke Polish language. Aristocracy means the socially standard people or nobles. They spoke Polish language. Other than these three dominant groups, there also lived within the boundary of empire a peasant communities called Bohemians and Slovaks. Bohemians and Slovaks were the two important peasants group who included in this empire. So, such different kinds of people lived under different kingdoms and countries in Europe. They did not easily promote a sense of political unity or a sense of collective belonging. Then, what was the only tie binding all these diverse people? It was nothing but they all connected to a common emperor of the region. So this was only thing that I belong to the kingdom of this king. That was only feeling that connected all of them. But they don't have any common sharing or collective identity or a common culture. So this was the real picture of Europe in mid 18th century. Then you just think, how did nationalism and the idea of the nation state emerge? Dear students, now we are going to understand the next topic, that is aristocracy, as well as the emergence of a new middle class. So this is a social community and this is a social change. And this community played a very important role in making nationalism possible in different parts of Europe. So understand, the aristocracy is nothing but the high class nobles. Socially, the high class group of people who belongs to the noble community is known as aristocracy. They were socially and politically placed high order, and they had land enough to cultivate and even to give for rent. They were the dominant class of the continent. The members of this aristocracy or the members of this aristocracy class were united by a common way of life. They owned large estates in the villages and also they owned big houses in the towns. These aristocrat people, they spoke French for the purpose of diplomacy and in high society. Most of these aristocrat people, they spoke French language. And these aristocrat families were even often connected by marriage relations. But understand that this powerful aristocracy, economically, socially, politically, they were very powerful, but their number, numerically if you consider, they were a small group. And the majority of the population of Europe even that time made up of peasants or the farmers. So just understand what is the aristocracy. It is nothing but the high class nobles who constitute a small number of people, but economically, socially, they were placed in high order. Later, the industrialization took place in Europe. First, it started in England, and second half of the 18th century, that means around 1780s, in France and different parts of German states, there occurred the industrialization, and as a part of industrialization, a new social groups, that means a working class population and middle class made up of industrialists, businessmen, professionals emerged. So this was actually a new middle class we call bourgeoisie emerged after the introduction of industrialization. In Central and Eastern Europe, these middle class people were smaller in number till late 19th century, and it was among the educated liberal middle classes that idea of national unity following the abolition of aristocratic privileges gained popularity. So just understand that these aristocrat people of Europe as well as the middle class people, the new middle class people who emerged after the industrial revolution, they were educated, they were liberal minded, and they even tried for the unity of nations, and they even wanted to abolish the privileges of aristocrats. So here you just briefly understand about this, what was aristocracy and how was this aristocracy replaced by the new middle class that formed after the industrial revolution. Dear children, now let's move to the third topic of today, that is liberal nationalism. Remember, we are discussing nationalism in Europe. What are the different processes, events that influences the creation of national spirit in Europe? So here, the idea of national unity in early 19th century Europe was closely related to the ideology of liberalism. Remember, liberalism is an ideology that closely related to the national identity in early 19th century Europe. Actually, the term liberalism derives from the Latin word liber, which means free. For the new middle classes, liberalism stood for freedom for the individual and equality of all before law. Remember, in Middle Europe, there was no equality before law. The society was based on different community as well as property. So this new idea of liberalism was welcomed by majority of the middle class people of Europe. It ensured the equality before law. Politically, this idea, that is liberalism, emphasized the concept of government by consent. Government by consent means government formed by the people. So, since the French Revolution, liberalism had stood for the end of autocracy and clerical privileges. We have seen during French Revolution, the monarchy as well as nobility and the dominance of the clergy all were demolished by the people. So liberalism was a very important idea that even worked in the French Revolution. But remember, this equality before the law, it actually did not happen for a long time in Europe. We have seen this universal suffrage, that means right to vote irrespective of all diversity. It marked an experiment in liberal democracy. Actually, in the beginning, we have seen that right to vote was given only to the property owning men. Only the men who have property, who were rich, were given right to vote in Europe. Men without property and all the women were excluded from political rights. During French Revolution, we have seen that only under the Jacobins, a small period, all adult males were given suffrage. But when the Napoleon came back, during Napoleonic power, again this suffrage or right to vote was reduced only to the propertied men and women were excluded. So throughout the 19th century as well as early 20th centuries, women and non-propertied men organized many movements demanding equal political rights. Remember, these all are the part of national identity. When there is a political right, equality before law, or universal suffrage for everybody, it is an important steps towards the political unity or cultural identity. As far as the economic sphere is considered, liberalism, this idea, liberalism, stood for the freedom of markets and the abolition of state imposed restrictions on the movement of goods and capital. So, liberalism means it's the idea that free from the clutches of bias, the government or the monarchy should abolish all the trade restrictions and the movement of the goods and capital should be made smooth. So, if you consider the German speaking region in the first half of the 19th century, if you consider, there was many principalities over a confederation of around 39 states. So, all these 39 states of the German Confederation had their own currency, their own weights and measure system. So, a merchant who is traveling in around 1833 from Habsburg to Nuremberg to sell his goods would had to pass through 11 custom barriers and to pay custom duty around 5% to each of them. So just I am trying to tell you that how confused and complicated were the currency system, weighing and measure system in one to another small state of Germany. So each region had its own system of weights and measures. So it involved loads of time consuming, and every country, every state collected the tax. So there was loads of economic laws and mismanagement during this time. So such a condition was viewed as an obstacle to economic exchange and growth by the new commercial classes. So these new middle class, these new commercial class, they argued for the creation of a unified economic territory. So now we can see in India we have a unified economic territory. All states are unified and we have single system of currency as well as measuring system. In Europe, at present if you consider there is euro, a single currency is enough to travel all the part of Europe. But in 18th century and as well as the beginning of 19th century, it was not like that. Every state inside a dynasty had a lot of currency system and measuring and weighing system. So these new commercial class people, they argued for a creation of a unified economic territory, allowing the movement of goods, people and capital without any obstacles. In 1839, a custom union called Zollverein was formed at the initiative of Prussia and joined by most of the German states. So Zollverein is a union of trade. This union abolished tariff barriers and reduced the number of currencies from over 30 to just 2 in number. So the role of Zollverein, this customs union formed by Prussia and other German states, reduced these taxes and number of currencies. There was only 2 currencies after the intervention of Zollverein. The creation of a network of railways further stimulated the movement of goods and commodities, and even it helped the economic interest of the many countries that ultimately helped them for national unification. So, a wave of economic nationalism, remember that economic nationalism or uh, togetherness or interlinking of economies of different communities and states is very important for political unification. So, a wave of economic nationalism strengthened the wider nationalist sentiments growing at the time. So, dear students, we have just understood what is liberalism and how the idea of liberalism emerged in Europe and how it simplified the economic systems, the trade systems, the currency systems, the tariff systems of Europe, and ultimately how the sovereign community or the sovereign customs union helped to unite the economic bondage between the states of Europe and how ultimately it strengthened the nationalist sentiments of Europe. So, dear students, today we have discussed these three topics. One is the mid 18th century European map, and secondly the aristocracy, what is aristocracy and what is the new middle class formed, and lastly we have discussed the liberal nationalism, how it affected the economic nationalism and ultimately influenced the emergence of nationalist sentiments in Europe. So read the textbook thoroughly, underline the points. These topics are not so easy, the lesson is also a little tough. So you have to repeatedly read and you have to make your own points in your point books and understand, and you have to try to connect the points one to another and to understand the concepts. So if you have any doubts regarding any of these topics, what is told, try to contact me. Few assignment questions will be sent along with this. Try to solve it and send me back. Thank you.